Even among the most notorious thugs, there are those who stand out for their sophistication and cruelty, real monsters. Today's story is about such monsters in human form. Capital punishment is one of the most controversial topics in the world's criminal system. Some people think that the death penalty for several bloody murders is fair, while others think that it is too much and that we should not be like these monsters, and during the execution they organize an impromptu candlelight vigil. Oscar Smith was born in 1949 in Ohio. He became one of 7 children of his parents. The entire close-knit family lived in Robertson County, Tennessee, USA, which was located about 50 kilometers from Nashville. Here, in his later years, Oscar got a job at an equipment maintenance company. He met Judith Roberts when she was working as a waitress at a nearby cafe. She had 2 sons from a previous marriage. Oscar also had teenage children by this time, a son and a daughter from his first wife. The couple married in 1985. About a year after these events, they had 2 more boys, twins. It was only 4 years before the problems in the marriage began. However, Judith often communicated with her family about what was happening. She complained that she feared for her life. Against this background, the woman initiated the separation, and all this caused great discontent in her husband. On the day when Judith told Oscar that she was leaving him, another heated argument took place. She even turned to her sister Teresa, who helped her and the children leave home. Oscar was behaving inappropriately at the time. They walked about a kilometer until the woman was able to pull herself together. Everyone was very nervous, even afraid that the man would chase them in anger. According to Judith, that evening the husband behaved so aggressively that he broke the pencil case and even bit her older children. And then he put a gun to the head of one of the sons. Thus, he tried to force everyone to stay in the house and insisted that if his wife tried to leave, the child would die. When Teresa spoke to the police, she said that after this incident, there were even more unpleasant events. Thus, in August 1989, Judith was forced to return to her husband's house. She decided to collect the remaining things and clothes for the children. Teresa wanted to accompany her from the very beginning, but it was necessary to wait until the end of the working day, and her sister refused. She thought that her husband had already calmed down and everything would go smoothly. But when the woman returned, there were obvious burns on her body, signs of tying on her wrists and strangulation on her neck. Judith then went to the police, stating that when she came to her husband's house to pick up her things, he immediately provoked a conflict, and then attacked her, tied her up, raped her, and threatened her with a knife, holding it to her throat. Oscar repeated over and over that he would kill her if she tried to leave him for another man. Oscar Smith, 40, was a working-class machinist by trade. From the outside, he might have seemed like a decent family man, but behind the scenes, his marriage had long since fallen apart. Those who knew the Smith family well saw how manipulative and cruel Oscar really was. At least, his wife complained about it constantly. A long history of domestic violence led to the woman deciding to leave the tyrant and no longer paying attention to his attempts to keep her. This only caused even more violent outbursts of aggression and jealousy, which looked frightening. During this period, Oscar threatened his wife many times. Many of his close circle knew this. Every time he remembered her in the presence of friends and acquaintances, his eyes with anger. All this was only aggravated by the numerous financial problems that befell the man at that time. On the surface, Oscar looked like a reserved and decent person. But behind this apparent calm, a real storm was raging. But even with his constant anger and problems, no one expected him to be capable of something cruel. At 11:20 p.m. on October 1, 1989, an alarming call was made to Nashville 911. 13-year-old Jason Burnett was recorded screaming on a 12-second recording that his family needed help. The dispatcher managed to hear screams in the background, someone asking to stop. It was probably the second boy. He gave an address. After that, the connection was lost. The police were sent to a house located in one of the Woodbine neighborhoods of Nashville. Oscar's ex-wife, 35-year-old Judith, and her children, including 2 school-age sons from a previous marriage, lived there. Jason Boyer, 13, and Chad Boyer, 16. The Smith children were visiting relatives that day. When police knocked on the door, no one answered. After examining the outside of the house and shining a light into the windows, they noticed something disturbing. There were signs of a struggle and disorder inside. So the law enforcement officers decided to break down the door and see what was going on. Here they found a bloody scene. Judith showed no signs of life. She had a gunshot wound to the neck, as well as several more stab wounds, also localized in the upper part of the body. Her son Chad was shot in the head. He had a bullet through his shoulder. The younger Jason was killed by a blow to the chest with a pick-like instrument. Judging by the scale of the brutality, the attack was personal. The criminal must have known his victims and had hit them. That is why he came here only to kill, leaving his victims no chance to survive. A forensic examination revealed the full extent of the brutality. In addition to their injuries, both boys had their throats cut from ear to ear. Their mother was found on an unmade bed. The woman was wearing blue jeans and a shirt. She was wounded in the left arm and neck. The fatal shot was fired from a pistol from a distance of no more than 2 meters. The bullet severed the spinal cord, causing instant paralysis, unconsciousness and rapid death. Jason Boyer, an 8th grader at the middle school, was found disemboweled. He was lying on his side at the foot of the bed where his mother was found. He was stabbed multiple times in the chest and abdomen. His injuries caused him to bleed to death within minutes. Chad Boyer, in addition to being stabbed with a tool, also suffered multiple gunshot wounds. An unknown person shot him in the left eye, shoulder, upper chest. In addition, he also received multiple stab wounds. The telephone in the house was torn out of the walls along with the wires, thrown on the floor and, apparently, trampled. Apparently, this was done precisely to prevent the boy from calling for help. No knife or firearm was found at the crime scene. However, bullets recovered from the bodies of the deceased showed that a .22 caliber pistol was used. The murdered woman's ex-husband, Oscar Smith, immediately became the prime suspect. After checking Judith's relationship history, it was discovered that her ex-husband had repeatedly spoken badly of her and was a cruel manipulator. Their divorce proceedings were complicated. The man was in a custody battle over their children, and their mother had made several accusations of domestic violence against him in recent months. Interestingly, these came not only from her, but also from her adult children from a previous marriage. Several witnesses reported that the man had been aggressive and cruel even during the marriage, and this was one of the main reasons for the separation. He was jealous of his wife towards everyone, provoked conflicts that became more dangerous with each passing year. Ultimately, he began to exert physical influence on his wife. When examining the scene of the Trickle murder, law enforcement officers found scattered things and overturned furniture. But it didn't look like a robbery. The door wasn't broken down, nothing was stolen, but the level of cruelty was extreme. Most likely, the criminal threw the items around during the struggle, or clumsily staged a robbery to confuse the investigation. During their work, the forensic experts didn't find much evidence. All the murder weapons that should have left fingerprints were taken from the house. However, a palm print was found on the sheet of Judith's bed. Initially, it was assumed to be partial, but a more thorough analysis showed that the criminal was missing 2 fingers on his hand. This was a very valuable indication. Another important point was the call made to the 911 emergency services. It was carefully listened to, using special equipment to hear the slightest sounds. The caller did not have time to provide the dispatcher with exhaustive information, but right before the shutdown he shouted words similar to Frank. Law enforcement officers decided to use this information, considering it a suicide note indicating the criminal. All this added to the list of incriminating evidence, since Oscar's middle name was Franklin, shortened to Frank. The man was interviewed, but he denied any involvement in the crimes. The most important thing was that during their conversation with him, the detectives noticed a hand that was indeed missing 2 fingers. According to Oscar, he had lost them while working at the plant several years ago, but such a coincidence seemed too unlikely. The police continued to talk to Judith's friends and family, and many considered him the only possible killer. Oscar. People described in detail the difficult divorce proceedings and financial problems. The man had recently had problems with his job, so he did not want to pay alimony. Against this background, his wife planned to demand in court that he be forced to do so. Some of the most incriminating testimony was given by Oscar's colleagues at work. Several people at once said that they heard him being very unhappy and threatening his ex-wife and even children. He repeatedly voiced the phrase, "If she is not mine, she will belong to no one." Oscar even looked for a killer among his colleagues who could kill his wife and her children from a previous marriage for $20,000. At the same time, he implied that their common children should not have suffered. But none of his colleagues agreed. Everyone considered this proposal an inappropriate joke. But even this did not put an end to the search for the culprit. Curiously, when Oscar learned of his wife's desire to divorce, he took out an insurance policy for Judy's son and her 2 sons for a total of about $100,000, becoming their sole beneficiary. He even tried to get money from these documents after the Trickle murder. The investigation progressed quickly. Within days, detectives had gathered a huge amount of information. Everything pointed to the crime being a classic case of domestic violence that had gone too far and turned into a trickle murder. Against this backdrop, by the end of October 1989, an arrest warrant had been requested against 40-year-old Oscar Smith. He was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. Curiously, all this caused a mixed reaction in the local community. Some were stunned and did not believe that such a decent and hard-working man as Oscar could commit such a brutal massacre. Others believed he deserved the harshest punishment, as they had heard he had abused his wife and children for years. Judith's family had a hard time coping with the loss. After speaking to police and journalists, they all said they believed Oscar was guilty and were glad the criminal would get what he deserved. They never doubted for a moment that he was the one who had committed the bloodbath. One of Oscar's neighbors said that the man had a very hot temper and behaved inappropriately when angry. It seemed that he could hardly control himself. However, not only close relatives but also Judith's friends had an unshakable belief in his guilt, who told how she constantly complained about him in the last years of their marriage. Judging by these stories, the woman seriously feared for her life during the divorce proceedings. Oscar insisted that all this was done specifically to discredit his name and deprive him of any privileges in the custody battle. On October 2, 1989, detectives visited the prime suspect to ask him questions about his ex-wife and sons. Investigators immediately noticed that he was talking about them in the past tense. Oscar had cuts on his arms, elbow, and shoulder blade. He attributed the cuts to a dog attack. The man showed absolutely no emotion when told of the horrific fate that had befallen his ex-wife and her children from a previous marriage. As more information was gathered at the crime scene, police were able to obtain a warrant to search the man's home. Several firearms and knives were confiscated during the investigation. The prosecution decided they had enough evidence. The alleged killer was arrested on November 26, 1989. When they arrived to arrest him, the man was at work. He behaved calmly and collectedly, refused to admit guilt in the triple murder, and also refused to cooperate with law enforcement agencies in principle. Judging by the information collected by the police, from June to August 1989, he threatened to kill his wife at least 12 times. This was reported by his colleagues, Judith's close friends and acquaintances. According to co-workers, Oscar threatened to kill a woman's children from a previous marriage, Chad and Jason, because he believed that the deceased treated them better than his biological children. At the trial, the jury was told that Oscar and his ex-wife began to establish contact. The lawyer found out that it started after the divorce, shortly before the triple murder. It became known that he and his ex-wife spent almost the entire day together. And in the evening, the attack occurred. They even went to lunch together at a restaurant that day, but there were no signs of aggression. Judith did not even tell anyone about these events. In response to this fact, the sister of the deceased was unable to give any comments. Teresa had no idea what could be the reason for the improvement in the relationship between the former spouses. Apparently, Oscar even offered to look after her children, since he had a day off the next day. The defense tactics were based on all this. A lawyer provided by the state said that the man had in fact made a mistake. Only later did he remember that he had to go to work in Merritt, Kentucky, the next day. Oscar had left for the town before the massacre. Immediately after meeting Judith, family members, including his birth mother, confirmed that he was with them at the time of the crime. However, the prosecution had an important witness who could refute this. A neighbor who lived a few houses away from the Smith family home noticed a familiar car of the man between 10:30 and 11 p.m. Even though the defendant was supposed to be in Kentucky at the time, his pickup truck was here. The defendant was missing 2 fingers, but the print itself was smudged, so it was impossible to accurately determine a pattern. The man tried to justify this fact by stating that he had no idea how his bloody right hand print could have ended up on the sheet next to the bodies of the victims. He continued to deny guilt, arguing that the missing 2 fingers could not be 100% proof, as if it were all circumstantial. Even he knew a black man from North Nashville who was missing the same fingers on the same hand. The lawyer insisted that, in addition to the print similar to Oscar's hand, several others were found in the house, including the defendant and another person. It was proven that the perpetrator attacked Judith and the children using gloves. One of them fell during the struggle with the eldest son. It was found near the blood-spattered wall in Jason's room. However, there was plenty of circumstantial evidence even without a fingerprint. A tool similar to the one used to kill one of the children, according to witnesses, was repeatedly used by Oscar. In addition, the same .22 caliber pistol was registered to him. An empty holster, just right for such a weapon, was found in his house, but the gun itself was missing. They couldn't even find a folding knife, which, according to numerous witnesses, the man always carried on his belt. Presumably, it was this knife that was used to commit all 3 murders. The psychiatrist who conducted the examination spoke for the defense. According to his conclusion, the defendant had serious problems. He suffered from paranoid personality disorder. The expert believed that this was due to his father's mental problems, who had been diagnosed with schizophrenia back in the 1940s. However, the investigation showed that Oscar was sane and aware of what was happening, so he was not given any restrictions. The insanity defense tactic did not work. During the trial, which began in 1990, the jury heard many things, including a telephone call to a dispatch service. In addition to the palm print, life insurance policies were a strong piece of evidence, providing additional motive for the murder. After hearing all that, it took the jury only a few hours to return a guilty verdict on all counts of murder. For each of these, Oscar was sentenced to death in the first degree. After the trial, he was transferred to Riverbend, a maximum security facility. Here he remained until the very moment of execution. As is usually the case with capital punishment, the lawyer filed numerous appeals. After the trial, the criminal refused the defense provided by the state. A new one entered the game. The reasons cited by the murderer's defense included ineffective defense, jury misconduct in sentencing, and investigators' errors. When new DNA testing techniques emerged in the 2000s, they were also used to seek a review. Since the start of the coronavirus pandemic, the execution has been postponed twice. In 2020, Oscar was one of 47 people in the state on death row, and one of 6 people sentenced to death in Tennessee in the year of the trial. Other bureaucratic issues arose. For example, under state law, an inmate sentenced to death for a crime committed before 1999 could choose between the electric chair and lethal injection. However, shortly before his death, the convict said that he did not want to choose the method. By default, the sentence was carried out by injection. After that, Oscar continued to fight for his life. He was one of dozens of death row inmates who joined the lawsuit, all arguing that the injection was state-sanctioned torture, with the drug supposedly creating a sensation of drowning and burning alive. Oscar was executed in 2022. However, just 1 hour before her execution, the state governor issued an order to temporarily halt the execution. This was due to the need to re-evaluate the effects of the drug chosen for the lethal injection. The lawsuit was satisfied. For Oscar, the decision extended his life on death row by several years. DNA testing did indeed produce a fingerprint that did not belong to the convict. However, the court ruled that the evidence was not sufficient to overturn the sentence. The prints may have been left by someone earlier, before the attack. Thus, by early 2024, all avenues for appeal had been exhausted. In April 2025, the governor signed the death warrant, which set the execution date for May 22 at 10 a.m. Before the performance, Oscar Smith was placed in a special chamber. This is a standard procedure that is used 72 hours before the scheduled date. The man was under 24-hour surveillance. Here he was allowed to use a very limited number of things. Among them was a Bible. While in the early years after his conviction, Oscar's children visited him periodically, in recent years they stopped doing so. The last days before his death they also refused to come. The only person who visited often was the spiritual mentor, namely the Reverend Monica Clay. She was allowed to accompany the murderer to the execution until his very last breath. On May 21st, the killer had his last meal. The next day, May 22, 2025, at 10 a.m., Oscar was escorted to the execution chamber. As correctional officers prepared for the lethal injection, the Reverend Monica Clay read from the scriptures. At 10:32 a.m. the viewing windows of the cell opened to allow witnesses to watch the proceedings. Oscar was given the right to make the final statement. The man once again declared his innocence and asked to convey to the governor that the justice system was not working. He again stressed that he did not kill Judith. Anyone who followed this event noticed that over the past 35 years he repeatedly claimed that he did not kill his wife. However, he never tried to clear himself of the charge of killing his wife's 2 children. Some concerned people even believed that he might have had an accomplice. This could explain both the extraneous fingerprint and the criminal's behavior. His behavior seemed strange, since usually murderers confess to everything before their death, in order to cleanse their souls. At 10:35, Oscar was given the lethal injection. 3 minutes later, his limbs began to convulse and his face turned blue until it turned purple. At 10:45, the viewing windows of the cell were closed. At 10:47 a.m., the man was pronounced dead. According to the expert, the execution took about 12 minutes, which is slightly longer than average, but nothing out of the ordinary happened. Against the backdrop of the lawsuit, which was signed by dozens of prisoners sentenced to death, everyone was watching the results of Oscar's autopsy. It later confirmed that the lungs had filled with fluid, which was common for the drug used to carry out executions. This was considered the main problem with the substance, as the process was supposed to be very painful, reminiscent of drowning. Curiously, for the last 5 years before execution, both the method and the substance were not used in the state at all. The reason was that the companies that produced the drug refused to cooperate with law enforcement. This caused another wave of discussion, as it became unclear how the state got hold of the drug to carry out the execution. After the killer's death, Judith's brother and sister spoke to reporters in the parking lot of the execution complex. They spoke holding a photograph of the 3 men who had died at the hands of this cruel man. According to the family, they did not take much pleasure in watching Oscar die, but they believed that it was a deserved punishment for the crime he had committed. For 35 years, they never doubted his guilt for a moment. It all seemed a little odd, as they were speaking in front of more than 50 activists who had gathered in the parking lot. All of these people were holding candles and holding an impromptu prayer vigil. They were speaking out against Oscar's death penalty in support